The morning it happened, I was wearing a gray cardigan. I remember that detail because later, much later, someone would describe the scene to a journalist, and they would write that I looked like I didn't belong there, standing in the marble lobby of one of Shanghai's most celebrated companies, surrounded by glass and steel and the kind of quiet that only money can purchase. They weren't wrong. I never looked like I belonged there. That was the point. His name was Jin Seok-hyun, Korean-born, Shanghai-raised, the kind of man who made the air feel thinner just by entering a room. He was brilliant and driven, and when he wanted to be, devastating in his tenderness. I had loved him the way you love something you built with your own hands, completely, without condition. 6 years, 6 years of early mornings in a city that wasn't mine, 6 years of learning a language so I could understand the whispers before they reached him, 6 years of folding myself smaller so he could stand taller. And that morning he handed me a manila envelope in front of 40 of his employees. He didn't lower his voice. "Renee," he said, in English, which he only used with me when he wanted distance, "I think we've both known for some time that this isn't working. My attorneys have drawn up a settlement. It's generous." The lobby had gone completely still. The glass elevator behind him held 3 people who had stopped pressing buttons. I could feel every eye in that room finding somewhere else to look, because watching this was uncomfortable, but they couldn't stop. I knew her before I turned around. Vivian Tang, Shanghai-born, polished in a way that looked effortless because she had spent years making it look that way. She stood behind Jin and slightly to the left, studying the middle distance with practiced neutrality, like she wasn't involved, like she hadn't spent the last 2 years making sure this moment would come. I looked at Jin. I looked at the envelope. Then I set it on the reception desk without opening it. "Keep it," I said, and I walked out. But here is what nobody in that lobby knew. What Jin didn't know. What even Vivian, with all her patience and precision, had never once thought to investigate. The woman they were watching walk out, the quiet one in the gray cardigan who looked like she didn't belong, was Renee Caldwell-Baptiste, not Renee Jin, not Renee Morgan, the name I had been living under for years. Renee Caldwell-Baptiste, granddaughter of Elias Caldwell-Baptiste, who had turned a single trucking contract in Augusta, Georgia, into a fortune, so vast and so deliberately quiet that most people in that building wouldn't have recognized the name, even if I'd said it out loud. They thought they were watching a woman leave with nothing. They had no idea what was about to walk back in. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever watched someone underestimate a woman simply because she was quiet? Because what he didn't know in that lobby is the kind of thing that changes everything. Stay with me and subscribe, because this one is going to leave you speechless. I called my grandfather from the car. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. Not because I wasn't hurting, because I was. The kind of hurt that doesn't announce itself. It just settles into your chest, like weather, quiet and permanent. But I had been raised by people who understood that grief was private and movement was mandatory. Elias Caldwell-Baptiste picked up on the second ring. He was 81 years old and sharper than most men half his age. "You ready to come home?" he asked. He always knew. "No," I said, "I'm ready to work." There was a pause, then that laugh, low and slow, the sound of old satisfaction. "I'll call Terrence." Behind me, in that marble lobby, Jin Seok-hyun was already moving forward with his morning. I knew him well enough to know that. He would straighten his jacket. He would say something calm and professional to whoever was standing nearest. He would make it look like a business decision rather than a burial. And Vivienne would be beside him, before the elevator doors opened. She thought she had won something. That was her first real mistake, and she would make several more before this was finished. What neither of them understood, what no one in that building had ever thought to question, was why a woman with my education, my instincts, my eye for structure and leverage had spent 6 years as a CEO's wife without once demanding to be seen. They assumed it was weakness or love or the particular kind of desperation they had assigned to me from the moment I arrived in Shanghai. This woman from Georgia, standing in spaces that had not been built with her in mind. But I hadn't been hiding because I was afraid. I had been hiding because I was proving something to myself. I had stepped away from my family's name deliberately at 26. I had wanted just once to be loved without the weight of inheritance attached to it. To know that what someone chose in me was me, not the legacy, not the trust, not the name that made rooms reorganize themselves. I had wanted to be just Renee, and for a while, with Jin, I believed I was. That belief had cost me 6 years. Now, somewhere over the Pacific, Terence Aldwin Beaumont, the man who had managed the Caldwell-Baptiste Trust since before I was born, was boarding a flight to Shanghai. And Renee Morgan, the quiet woman in the gray cardigan, was being retired. What was coming next had a different name entirely, and Jin Seok-hyun had absolutely no idea what he had just put into motion. Let me take you back to where it actually started. Not the lobby, not the envelope, not Vivienne standing in her practice silence like she had nothing to do with any of it. Further back, a gallery in Brooklyn, a Tuesday afternoon in October. The kind of quiet that only small art spaces carry, where your footsteps sound too loud and you start walking softer without meaning to. I was 26. I had been living in Brooklyn for 4 months under my mother's maiden name, Renee Morgan. No family connections, no private cars, a modest apartment, a part-time curatorial role at a small gallery in Dumbo, and the first real breath I had taken in years. I had stepped away from my position as the youngest board observer in the history of Caldwell-Baptiste Holdings because I was exhausted by people who only saw the name. I wanted to know, just once, what it felt like to exist without it. That was where Jin found me. He was standing too long in front of a mid-century abstract piece, brow furrowed, genuinely confused by it, and this was the part that caught me, completely unwilling to pretend otherwise. I made a small comment, something about negative space and what the artist was refusing to show. He turned. He laughed, not the polished laugh of a man performing charm, the real one, unguarded. We talked for 3 hours. He never asked what I did for a living. I never told him my last name. And somewhere in those 3 hours, I made a decision that would cost me 6 years of my life. I chose to let him love Renee Morgan because I was desperate to know what it felt like to be chosen without the weight of everything I carried. He was real in that gallery. I am still certain of it. But real is not always the same as ready, and the man who laughed at a painting he didn't understand would one day hand me an envelope in a lobby without blinking. That contradiction never stopped hurting. She never came at me directly. That was what made her dangerous. Vivienne Tang had been in Jin's professional world long before I arrived in Shanghai. She was sharp, Shanghai-born, and wore her ambition the way other women wore jewelry, openly, deliberately, without apology. I didn't dislike her at first. I actually respected her precision. That was my second mistake. Because Vivienne wasn't building a career, she was building a position, and the only thing standing between her and that position was me. But she was patient the way people are when they've decided on an outcome and are simply managing the timeline toward it. She didn't attack, she whispered, Small things placed carefully into conversations with Jin, that I seemed lost in Shanghai, that the cultural distance might be too wide, that perhaps I wasn't equipped for the life he was building, that I was, and this is the word she chose with surgical precision, a liability. What she never mentioned was the 2 years I had spent doing pro bono financial consulting for minority-owned businesses in Pudong, quietly, without fanfare, because that is how I was raised, wealth whispers. She never mentioned the non-profit partnership I had been negotiating, $42 million in arts and entrepreneurship funding across Southeast Asia, nearly finalized, built entirely on relationships I had cultivated on my own. She omitted those things, and Jin, somewhere along the way, had stopped asking about my days. That is the part that stayed with me longest. Not Vivian's ambition. Ambition I understood. It was the silence on his end, the slow withdrawal of curiosity about who I was outside of his lobby, his dinner table, his carefully ordered life. Vivian didn't turn him against me. She simply filled the space he had already started leaving empty. And I had let her, because I was still trying to prove that I could hold a marriage together through patience and love and quiet strength alone. But here is what she never calculated, in all her precision and strategy and long game planning. She had spent 2 years studying who I appeared to be. She had never once asked who I actually was. That oversight was going to cost her everything. The morning it happened, I woke to an empty bed. That wasn't unusual. Jin was always gone before the city fully opened its eyes. Early meetings, early calls, the particular discipline of a man who believed that time was the only currency that couldn't be recovered. I had learned not to reach for him in the mornings, learned to treat his absence like weather, something you adjusted to rather than questioned. What was unusual was the message on my phone. It was from Pei Shulan, Jin's personal assistant, a young woman who had always treated me with the kind of genuine warmth that doesn't exist in corporate buildings unless someone chose it deliberately. She didn't have to be kind to me. I was the CEO's wife, not her supervisor, but she was, consistently, quietly, without being asked. The message read, "Mrs. Jin, please don't come to the lobby today." 5 words, no explanation. I read it twice. Then I put down my coffee, picked up my bag, and went to the lobby, because I already knew. Not the details, not the envelope or the legal team or the practice distance in his voice, but the shape of it. I had felt it coming the way you feel a season changing, something in the air that your body understands before your mind is ready to. He was standing near the reception desk in a charcoal suit, flanked by 2 members of his legal team, composed in the way that only people who have rehearsed a moment can be composed, and behind him, slightly to the left, Vivienne, positioned exactly the way people position themselves when they want to witness something without being responsible for it, close enough to see everything, far enough to claim nothing. Jin looked at me when I walked in. Something moved across his face, so briefly that if I hadn't spent 6 years learning every variation of his expression, I would have missed it entirely. Then it was gone. "Renee," he said. "English, distance. I think we've both known for some time that this isn't working. My attorneys have drawn up a settlement. It's generous. You'll have time to make arrangements." The lobby had stopped breathing. 40 employees. The glass elevator frozen mid-floor. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at Vivian, who was studying the middle distance with the focus of a woman who had prepared for exactly this scene. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, and I set it on the reception desk without opening it. "Keep it," I said. Then I walked out of that building and out of the life I had been quietly, carefully, faithfully building for 6 years without looking back once. But here is what nobody standing in that lobby understood. I wasn't walking away defeated. I was walking away decided. And those two things could not be more different. You know what breaks my heart about this moment? She never once begged, never raised her voice, never gave them the reaction they were prepared for. And somehow, that quiet dignity hurt more to watch than any tears could have. If you've ever rooted for a woman the world counted out too soon, stay with me. Subscribe before this story goes any further, because what she does next is something nobody in that lobby saw coming. Not Jin, not Vivienne, not even the people who thought they knew her best. I made one phone call from the car, not to a friend, not to a lawyer, not to anyone who would offer me sympathy or talk me through what had just happened in careful, gentle tones. I called my grandfather. Renee Caldwell-Baptiste answered on the second ring. 81 years old, built like a man who had never once in his life waited for permission. His voice had the texture of worn leather, familiar, unbreakable, and warm in a way that had nothing to do with softness. "You ready to come home?" he asked. No greeting, no what happened or are you okay, just that, because Elias always knew. He had known things about me before I knew them myself for as long as I could remember. "No," I said, "I'm ready to work." The pause that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then came the laugh, low, slow. The specific sound of a man who has been waiting a long time to hear something and is deeply, privately satisfied that it finally arrived. "I'll call Terrence," he said. That was all. No speech, no strategy, no long conversation about what I was feeling or what came next. Just those 3 words, because in the Caldwell-Baptiste family, calling Terrence meant the machinery was moving. It meant something real was beginning. Terrence Aldwin Beaumont had managed our family's legal and financial affairs since before I was born. He was methodical, discreet, and completely without mercy when the situation required it. Within 48 hours of that phone call, he was on a flight to Shanghai. I sat in that car for a long time after I hung up. The city moved around me the way Shanghai always did, indifferent, relentless, magnificent in its total refusal to pause for anyone's private pain. But I wasn't in pain anymore. I was in motion, and somewhere, in a charcoal suit on the 14th floor, Jin Seok-hyun was straightening his jacket and moving forward with his morning, completely unaware that the woman he had just dismissed had made one phone call that would rearrange everything he thought was secure. He had no idea what was coming. Neither did Vivienne, but Terrence did. Renee Morgan had served her purpose. She was the name I had borrowed when I wanted to disappear. The version of myself I had constructed carefully, modestly, so I could move through the world without the weight of everything my family had built, pressing down on every interaction, every relationship, every conversation. Renee Morgan had loved Jin Seok-hyun without conditions or calculations, had learned Mandarin in a city that didn't ask her to stay, had folded herself into a life that was never quite the right shape, and told herself that love was supposed to require that kind of sacrifice. Renee Morgan had set an envelope on a reception desk and walked out with nothing. She was done now. Terrence arrived in Shanghai on a gray Thursday morning, carrying a single briefcase and the particular calm of a man who had untangled much larger situations than this one. We met in a private room at a hotel that Jin had never once suggested we visit together, which made it feel appropriately like neutral ground. He laid out the documents without ceremony, trust instruments, asset structures, letters of authorization bearing my full legal name, the one I had not used in 6 years. Renee Caldwell-Baptiste, Signing those papers felt like exhaling after holding my breath for longer than any person should. The first thing that moved was the nonprofit partnership I had spent 2 years quietly building. The announcement was released simultaneously across 3 major financial and cultural publications. It identified me by my full name and my correct background, a Caldwell-Baptiste heir, the primary facilitating donor behind a $42 million arts and entrepreneurship initiative spanning Southeast Asia. The coverage was immediate. The second thing was the profile piece. A journalist had approached me 8 months earlier, had done her research, understood the story she was holding, and had been patient enough to wait when I asked her to. I finally said yes. The piece ran in a prominent international business magazine. The headline read, "The Heiress Nobody Knew." I was told Jin saw it on a Tuesday morning, that he read it once, set it down, then picked it up and read it again, that he called his attorney immediately after, then Vivian, then sat in his office with the lights off for a very long time. I want to be honest about how that made me feel, not satisfied, not vindicated, just finally visible. For 6 years I had been standing in rooms full of people who looked through me like glass, and now the glass was gone. What they saw underneath it was going to change everything. But the profile piece, as significant as it was not the thing that truly shifted the ground beneath Jin Seok-hyun's feet. That came from my grandfather. Caldwell-Baptiste Holdings had been tracking a logistics and real estate consortium in eastern China for well over a year. It was the kind of acquisition our family approached the way we approached everything, quietly, deliberately, without announcing intention until the moment intention became fact. The consortium held debt leverage across 3 companies, supply chain positions, long-term contracts that several major firms in the region depended on to function smoothly. One of those firms was a key supplier to Jin's company. I want to be precise about something here, because precision matters to me more than drama. My grandfather did not make this acquisition for me. Elias Caldwell-Baptiste had not built what he built by allowing emotion to direct capital. He moved on this because the numbers supported it, the timing was right, and the strategic position was sound. He called me the morning it closed. "We didn't do this for you," he said. His voice carried that familiar steadiness, the tone of a man reporting facts, not feelings. "We did it because it was good business." A pause. "But I don't mind that it's good for you, too." For my grandfather, that was poetry. The effect on Jin's world was not immediate and loud. It was slow and structural, the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself with noise, but makes itself known gradually, the way a foundation crack becomes visible only after the building has already begun to settle wrong. Supply timelines tightened, contract renegotiations opened, conversations that Jin had assumed were stable suddenly required more careful handling. And at the center of every one of those conversations, whether his team recognized it or not, was the name Caldwell-Baptiste, the name his wife had never once used in 6 years of marriage. I heard about his reaction through Pei Shulan, who remained one of the few people in that entire season of my life whose loyalty had never been something she calculated. Apparently, after the acquisition news reached him, after the profile, after the announcement, after the pieces assembled themselves into a picture, he could no longer avoid seeing Jin Seok-hyun sat alone in his office with the lights off for a long time, and the man who had handed me an envelope in a lobby finally began to understand what he had actually been holding. Nobody came to check on him. That was the detail Pei Shulan mentioned almost as an afterthought, and it was the detail that stayed with me longest. Jin Seok-hyun, who had built a company around loyalty and performance and the expectation that rooms would reorganize themselves around his presence, sat alone in his darkened office for over an hour, and not one person knocked. I think about what that silence must have felt like for a man like him. A man who had never once in his professional life been caught without information, without leverage, without the upper hand in any room he entered. The profile had landed first. He had read it twice, which told me everything, because Jin never read anything twice unless it had fundamentally disrupted something he believed to be settled. Then the acquisition news reached his team. Then his attorney called. Then he called Vivienne. And whatever that conversation contained, Pei Shulan didn't have details, and I didn't ask. It clearly wasn't the conversation either of them had prepared for. Because here is what was unraveling in real time. Behind that darkened office door, Jin was reconstructing 6 years of marriage through completely new information. Every moment he had dismissed as ordinary was reassembling itself into something that looked, from this new angle, entirely different. The woman who learned Mandarin in the evenings, who spent 2 years consulting for small businesses without mentioning it, who had negotiated a $42 million initiative while he was deciding she was a liability. He hadn't married someone who needed his world. He had married someone who had quietly been building her own right beside him while he looked straight through her. That realization doesn't arrive gently. It lands, and from what I was told, it landed hard. Can I be honest with you for a second? Because this is the part of the story that gets me every time. He had everything, and he didn't see it until it was already gone. If you've ever watched someone realize too late what they threw away, you already know how this feels. Subscribe and stay with me, because what Jin does next, and what Vivienne is about to unleash on herself, will change this entire story. Here is the thing about people who build their lives on strategy. They become so focused on the moves they are making, they stop watching the moves they are missing. Vivienne Tang had spent 2 years dismantling my marriage with surgical patience. She had whispered the right things to the right person at exactly the right moments. She had positioned herself perfectly, always close enough to benefit, always far enough to deny involvement. She was good at it. I will not pretend otherwise, but the moment Jin's world began shifting, the moment the ground beneath his company started moving in ways his team couldn't immediately explain, Vivienne did what insecure strategists always do when they feel control slipping. She overreached. In the weeks following the divorce filing, she moved quickly to consolidate her position inside Jin's company. She needed to matter, needed to be irreplaceable before anyone started asking questions about how exactly the marriage had unraveled and who had been standing closest when it did. In doing so, she made one critical error. She used her access to internal financial forecasts, information she held because of her proximity to Jin, to benefit a competing firm, a firm where her brother held a quietly undisclosed stake. It was a small thread, but threads, once found, have a way of unraveling everything attached to them. The investigation began internally. A compliance officer flagged an irregularity. One question led to another. Within weeks, what had started as an internal review escalated into a regulatory inquiry that Vivienne could not manage, could not whisper away, and could not position herself out of. She was removed from her position. I am told she relocated shortly after, and I want to be precise about something, because it matters deeply to me that this is understood correctly. I did not do that to her. I never touched her, never made a call, never pulled a thread. Vivian's ending was written entirely in her own hand. She had spent 2 years making herself my story. I was never hers. 3 weeks after the acquisition closed, my phone lit up with a name I had not expected to see. Jin Seok-hyun. Not a call he wouldn't call, because calling requires the other person to respond in real time, and Jin had always been a man who preferred to control the terms of a conversation before entering it, so he sent a message instead. It was formal, carefully worded. The kind of message a person writes and rewrites several times before sending, where you can feel the weight of every deleted sentence in the ones that remain. It read, "Renee, I owe you more than I understood. I don't expect a response. I only want you to know that I see clearly now what I refused to see then. I read it once. Then I set my phone face down on the table and looked out the window for a long time. People have asked me, since then, in various ways, whether reading those words felt like relief, whether it gave me something I had been waiting for, whether the acknowledgement from him meant anything after everything that had come before it, and my honest answer is this: it meant something. I won't pretend it didn't. There is a part of every person that wants the one who hurt them to finally, fully see it. But meaning something and changing something are not the same. He saw me clearly now, 3 weeks after the world made it impossible not to. 3 weeks after the publications, the acquisition, the $42 million announcement had assembled the picture he had refused to look at for 6 years. I did not respond. Not because I was cold, not because I wanted to punish him, but because some truths arrive too late to be answered, and silence, real silence, is sometimes the only honest thing left. I live in a quieter city now. I won't tell you which one, not because it's a secret, but because the location doesn't matter nearly as much as what I found there, which was simply myself. The version of me that existed before I decided that love required shrinking. Before I confused loyalty with disappearance, I still wake early. That never changed. I still carry too much hot sauce in my bag, which my assistant finds both baffling and endearing. I serve on 2 boards and consult for a 3rd, and last spring I completed the nonprofit initiative that my grandfather called, in the highest compliment he had ever paid me, the most elegant deal I had ever structured. Coming from Renee Caldwell-Baptiste, that was everything. My days are full in a way that has nothing to do with performance. I am not busy proving anything to anyone, not to Jin, not to Shanghai, not to Madame Choi and her marble smile, not to the 40 employees who stood frozen in that lobby and watched me set down an envelope without opening it. I think about Jin sometimes, not the lobby version, not the man in the charcoal suit with the practice distance and the legal team positioned like furniture around him. I think about the man in the gallery, the one who stood confused in front of a painting he didn't understand and refused, completely, almost stubbornly, to pretend otherwise. The one who laughed without calculating how it landed, the one who talked to a stranger for 3 hours and never once asked what she was worth. That man was real. I am still completely certain of it. But real is not always enough, and I had finally, after 6 years of hoping otherwise, made peace with that truth. There is one person in this entire story I have never spoken about publicly, until now. Her name was Pei Shulin, Jin's personal assistant. 28 years old, precise and warm in equal measure, the kind of person who made a corporate building feel slightly more human just by existing inside it. She had no reason to warn me that morning. Her loyalty was to Jin. Professionally, contractually, practically, warning his wife not to come to the lobby served nothing. It risked her position. It complicated her relationship with the man who signed her paychecks and whose opinion of her directly shaped her career. She sent that message anyway. 5 words, no explanation, just please don't come today. I came anyway, and I have never once blamed her for that. She tried, and in a building full of people who had chosen convenience over conscience every single day for years, that attempt mattered more than she will ever fully understand. After everything unraveled, after the profile, the acquisition, Vivian's removal, Pei Shulin quietly reached out to me. Not for opportunity, not for connection to the Caldwell-Baptiste name, just to say she was glad I was okay. That was it. In a season of my life, crowded with people whose affections were entirely transactional, she was the one who showed up simply because she was the kind of person who showed up. I think about that more than I think about Jin's message, more than the acquisition, more than the headline. Some forms of loyalty don't make the news, but they are the ones worth keeping. My grandmother Dorothea had a saying she returned to so often it became less a piece of advice and more a kind of household weather. Baby, a crown don't need to announce itself. You'll know who's wearing one by who's still standing when the room clears. I heard those words for the first time when I was 9 years old, sitting on her porch in Augusta on a humid July evening while she shelled butter beans and talked about a woman in her church who had been publicly humiliated by her husband and had chosen, deliberately, gracefully, not to collapse. I didn't fully understand it then. I understand it completely now, because here is what the lobby never showed. Here is what the profile piece only partially captured. Here is what even the acquisition, as structurally significant as it was, could only gesture toward from the outside. I was never the woman they thought they were dismissing. I was never lost in Shanghai, never culturally overwhelmed, never quietly falling apart behind the scenes of a life that didn't fit. I was building consistently, methodically, without announcement, because that is what the women in my family do. We build while the room is looking elsewhere. We structure while the conversation stays surface. We prepare while everyone around us assumes we are simply waiting. My grandfather built an empire from a single trucking contract because he understood one fundamental truth, that the most powerful position is the one nobody thinks to defend against. I had learned that lesson before I could drive. And Jin, brilliant, calculated, perceptive Jin, had spent 6 years living beside a woman shaped by that doctrine, and had never once thought to look beneath the surface of her quietness. Vivian had spent 2 years studying who I appeared to be. She had catalogued my silences, mapped my absences, weaponized my patience. But she had built her entire strategy on a version of me that was never the complete picture. Neither of them had asked the right question, not, why isn't she fighting back, but, what does a woman who was raised to let wealth whisper look like when she finally decides to speak? She looks like a $42 million initiative landing in 3 publications simultaneously. She looks like an acquisition that restructures your supply chain without a single confrontation. She looks like a magazine headline that reframes 6 years of perceived weakness into one devastating sentence. She looks like a woman who set an envelope on a reception desk and walked out of a lobby with more dignity than everyone still standing in it combined. The crown was never missing. It was never lost, never taken, never something I needed to reclaim. I'd been wearing it the entire time. I was simply, finally, done being the only one in the room who knew it. And now the room knew, and the room would not forget. I want to tell you something nobody writes about. Not the acquisition, not the headline, not the moment the lobby froze and 40 people watched a woman in a gray cardigan set down an envelope and walk out without looking back. I want to tell you about the morning, months later, when I woke up in my quiet city, made my coffee, and sat by the window watching the light come in, and felt nothing missing. Not relief, not triumph, not the particular satisfaction people expect you to feel when justice arrives and the scales finally balance. Just wholeness. A quiet, settled, unannounced sense of being exactly where I was supposed to be, inside a life that finally fit the actual shape of me. That morning was the real ending, not the publications, not the acquisition, not Vivian's removal or Jin's message, or the headline that reframed 6 years of silence into something the world finally recognized as strategy. The ending was that window, that coffee, that ordinary, unremarkable morning where I needed nothing to be different than it was. I think about what I lost, because I did lose something real. I lost the man in the gallery, the one who stood genuinely confused in front of a painting and couldn't perform certainty about it, the one who talked to a stranger for 3 hours because the conversation was more interesting than anything waiting for him elsewhere. That man had been real. He had loved me in the way that only people who don't know what they're holding can love, completely, carelessly, without the weight of calculation. But real and ready are different things, and I had spent 6 years learning that lesson at a cost I will never fully name out loud. What I gained, I am still counting. I gained my name back, not as armor, not as a weapon, simply as the truth of who I had always been before I decided that love required disguising it. I gained the work, the $42 million initiative that my grandfather called elegant, the boards, the consultancy, the knowledge that I am capable of building something significant completely on my own terms, without inheritance as a crutch or a man's approval as a compass. I gained the mornings. The world had spent 6 years treating my silence as vacancy, had looked at a brown-skinned woman from Augusta, Georgia, standing in Shanghai's most celebrated spaces, and seen someone who didn't belong, someone decorative, peripheral, easily dismissed. They saw vacancy, but I was never empty. I was never lost, never broken, never the version of myself they needed me to be so their assumptions could stay comfortable. I was Renee Caldwell-Baptiste. I was the granddaughter of a man who built an empire from nothing by understanding that the most powerful move is the one nobody sees coming. I was the woman who walked out of that lobby without the envelope, and I am exactly who I was always going to be. The crown never left my head. I just finally stopped apologizing for wearing it. And that is where her story finds its peace. Not in his regret, not in Vivian's downfall, not in the headlines or the acquisition or the moment the world finally looked up and saw her clearly. Her peace came from within. From the morning she woke up and needed nothing to be different. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever been the woman in the room that people looked through instead of at, then you already know exactly what this felt like. Subscribe before you go, because every story on this channel is built for the woman the world underestimated. And trust me, we are just getting started.